Hello and welcome to The Herd Has Spoken, a podcast brought to you by Muskox Men's Apparel. Hello again, guys. This is Brad Hoos, leader of the Muskox Herd and your host of The Herd Has Spoken. I'm really excited about episode 15 and my conversation with Adrian Fortino. Adrian Fortino is a partner at Mercury Fund, an early stage venture capital fund that has over $300 million at work, predominantly in the middle of the United States, with emerging companies doing software as a service, doing AI, data science, basically anything that's new and smart, primarily in the business to business world. So Adrian is a good friend of mine who I've known for many years, one of the smartest investors that I know. Adrian is also an entrepreneur. He was an operator of businesses for years, actually founded Sidecar, one of the early competitors to Uber many years ago. Adrian's now branched off. He's actually now a lecturer. I would just go ahead and say professor at the University of Michigan, teaching a lot around entrepreneurship and venture capital. But Adrian and I talk a lot about the skills that are needed to be a successful entrepreneur and how he's come to get those skills as a competitor, someone who loves to compete, just to work his ass off, coming from a small town in Michigan to a spot where now he's leading some pretty significant investments. So with no further ado, my conversation with Adrian Fortino. You and I have known each other for a number of years across a lot of your pursuits. And they're worth noting, I guess, right from the beginning, as an entrepreneur, as an investor, as now, I will say, a professor, you might say lecturer at the University of Michigan. So obviously an accomplished guy. To me, you're just Adrian. But one of the things I've come to appreciate so much about you is your love of tradition. So you have a fantastic post-Christmas party every year, which we can get into. You've hosted a flag football game until our collective knees expired on an annual basis. And you're sort of one of those people that finds ways to get people together on a regular basis. So I'd love to kind of kick off by asking you, why is it that tradition is so important to you?
Well, thanks for having me, Brad, first. It's good to see you, my friend. It's a great question, and it's one that I've not thought about before, but I'll try to come up with something, but I feel like, I don't know, I'm a very nostalgic person. I've always been a very nostalgic person. And I guess I feel like, and I also am incredibly sort of community focused and community driven. I think that probably comes from a few things. Like, I grew up in a very small town in the middle of Michigan, right? Elma, Michigan. Town of, like, when I was there, 10,000 people, right? So everybody knew everybody. And I think that there's something to that I sort of strive to build community and build relationships kind of in all walks of my life. And I think there's nothing more important than building genuine relationships with people, right?
Well, I want to come back to your childhood and dig more into this, but and we'll talk about a lot of what you're doing now. But I want to just butt in for a second here and say that when people typically think of venture capitalists, which you are, and you work for a very well respected organization, Mercury Fund, they don't usually think about community builders, right? And so how do you mentally think about that, where as a venture capitalist, you have to be pretty damn focused at providing returns to your investors, and yet you've obviously garnered a tremendous amount of success by caring so much about those around you and community. And I think that's a tough thing for a lot of us to wrap our heads around. So how do those come together?
Yeah, it's a great question. So look, I am a founder first, right? If when I think about myself and if I how I would identify, I identify as a founder operator first. That was my first entree into anything startup community, anything around that. And I am a venture capitalist, now, and that's what I do as my full time occupation, and I enjoy it a great deal. But that doesn't mean that I don't still have um, my philosophy or my kind of the way that that what drives me is still building community, and so it is something that I've always been passionate about. In fact, some friends from Ann Arbor remember, like, once I got back from going to California all the time, I got back, and this is in I don't know, end of end of 12, something like that. And I saw that there were a lot of people sort of on their own, doing their own, startup, like living their own startup journey, but almost in their own, worlds, right? And I kind of saw that, and I knew what was happening, having been in the Bay Area, and how much more connectivity there was about founders kind of relying on other founders to get through difficult situations. And so as I saw that, I was like, man, I gotta see if I can do something, and connect some people. So this is when Dave Lynn and I were running Flock Tag together. We ended up doing these Friday beer sessions, like we call it, kind of beers and tears, where I would bring in and invite, not many, like 10-ish founders, and some folks that are still in town remember doing this. Bryden Hayden was there, Molly and Mike from Adapted were there, and we would come in and we would just be like, this is messed up. Like, I don't know how to deal with this. How do you deal with this? Right? Because I don't know what to do. And we have, and Brian Hayden and I actually we actually were talking about this early on, because he had come in from Boston, and it was this kind of mutual kind of concept that we came together, like, hey, let's see what I've experienced in San Francisco and he's experienced in Boston, try to put this together, right? And I think, like, that is always something that drives me, and that kind of goes back to the work that I did at Invest Detroit. Well, fast forward to Mercury. One of the things that I was most excited about joining my partners at Mercury, this is 6.5 years ago, because they were community builders in Houston. Like, you think Houston is a big town. It is a big city, fourth biggest city in the country. Completely nascent when it comes to venture capital.
Absolutely.
Right? And you've been there, Brad, you know my partners. And so my guys down there, they were building accelerators. They were building fund of funds. They were building things down there. And so it is like ingrained in our fund, in our as people. It's like, we are community builders, and we are completely upfront about that with our LP base. And it's important because we invest in the middle of the country. We don't invest in the completely built out capital sectors like the West Coast and the Northeast. When you're building in places that are still emerging, you got to do more. You can't just be like the capital coming in and
right.
like, because there's a well-oiled machine, right? You gotta do the work to help build out that community. We believe that, we know that, we've always done that, and we'll always do that.
Yeah, I love that so much, because there are probably 10 or so, and you could make an argument that it's smaller or higher, but there's 10 or so VCs out there, and I'll just say nationally, that everyone in the startup community knows, and they're really aspirational, and startups are going to find those organizations, and they're going to get great deal flow, and that's great. And disproportionately, those organizations support startups that are in the Bay Area and the Northeast. And that leaves a hell of a lot of opportunity for everything in between. Yeah. I think it's so smart in terms of what you guys are doing. And I've always appreciated the ability to kind of find the white space. And that's clearly something that you've done over time. So you mentioned a couple of buzz terms, or I guess not buzz terms, but some things that you've done in the past, and I just kind of want to bring those to the surface. So you mentioned flock tag. So flock tag, from my understanding, was really your second big soiree into entrepreneurship, or being an operator. So can you kind of walk us through how you went from being an engineering student at the University of Michigan to being then a multiple a multiple business founder, and then getting into the investment world? But we'll get into the investment world first. I'm really curious about that venture from being a college student and an engineer into being a startup founder. How the heck did that happen?
Yeah. So you're right. Mechanical engineer undergrad from Michigan, graduated in 2000. When you graduate in 2000 and you're a mechanical engineer, you had one choice. It seemed like you had one choice, right? You go into automotive. Either that or just I wasn't creative enough at the time to think about something else. So I was like, oh, I interned here. I guess I should work there, right? And so I went into this company called Ricardo, which is an engineering consulting firm that worked for all the large OEMs in the auto world. And it was just the most wonderful place to grow up professionally. I got to do all kinds of great work. I traveled the world. I lived in the UK. Like, it was just, I mean, it was magical in the way that I was able to build up both an engineering mind and a business mind. That said, fairly early on, I knew that I wanted to get into the world of entrepreneurship. I didn't know how, I didn't know what, and I didn't know where.
Let me just pause you right there.
Mm-hmm.
How did you know that? Because when you're going through engineering, I mean, it's in the weeds. It is in depth. You don't have a lot of time to learn about business or anything except details of mechanical engineering. So where did this desire and knowledge that you wanted to start something on your own come from?
Yeah, two reasons, right? One sort of internally driven, one externally driven. So the internally driven was that my grandfather and father were both business owners. They're lawyers, right? But they had their own practice, right? And they, and they had that. I kind of saw the way that they were able to operate as owners of that business, right? And some of the kind of freedoms they had, and the ability to kind of be beyond their own. And there was an aspirational aspect of that. I mean, my dad said, since I can remember, never be a lawyer. So that didn't
good advice, if you ask me.
But I still thought like there was something there. So that's the internally piece. The external piece is that once I got into automotive, I saw what my boss's boss's boss and were how they operated and what it looked like from a corporate perspective in auto. And I felt like that sort of senior level management, like what most people would in auto would probably would aspire to, I didn't feel like it was right for me. Mm-hmm. I thought there's too much bureaucracy. There's just too much, BS that I think my friends had to deal with. And lots of things that, whether it's like, bad behavior from peers, the backstabbing, just the stuff that you just see across corporate life.
So
at least I did.
So you're wired as a child and in your formative years to really appreciate the ability to do something on your own. And then you get into this engineering world and you say, wow, this is really cool. I really like what I'm doing. I know you were putting in a huge amount of effort, but you also said, but this is interesting. This is a great launching point for me, but I don't see myself climbing the ranks here to a senior level because the way it's set up is not something I aspire towards.
Yeah.
And so at that point, you start to look at the horizon and you recognize that there might be some opportunities to start some things on your own.
That's right. That's right. And here's the end. There was a point where, Ricardo North America, I knew the president well. There's a couple there, and it's sort of like they had all the responsibility, but none of the control. right? Because the UK kind of mothership was always controlling, kind of pulling strings and stuff like that. I'm like, man, if that's like the top job in the country for this company, man, that doesn't seem that great, right?
Sure.
And so that was where I kind of felt like it was the time to try to figure it out, and I didn't know what to do. So my path was much like you. Let's go get an MBA. Let's go to it was Michigan Business School at the time. It turned into Ross during my time there, and that was purely on the basis of I had learned about the Zellery Institute. I had learned about that opportunity to kind of figure things out effectively there.
And what is
so
the
that's why I
Zellery
went.
Institute?
It's the Entrepreneurship Institute in the business school, right? And so it was established before I was there from Sam Zell and Bob Lurie, and so that's kind of why. There's one reason I wanted to go to Michigan. I love Michigan, but a lot of times people say, hey, don't double up on your undergrad and grad school. But I was like, I want that. It's here. Like, I'm just going to do that, right? So big practical. And it was a great decision, Brad, because I went, I networked, I found a lot of people, and it's still a very warm place, right, for people that are learning, for students. And so I just, I ended up meeting, a couple of just wonderful mentors in that program. One was Tony Grover from RPM Ventures. The other was Tom Porter. And so these guys became like go-to mentors for me while I was still at Ricardo. And I would just continue to ask them, hey, what's the right path forward? And I learned about venture capital and this and that, and ended up just kind of, finding my way to this startup that was just getting off the ground in Ann Arbor. And I was through most of the MBA program, and I was like, you know what, now or never. And decided to jump in, took an 80% pay cut, didn't get nearly enough equity, and jumped in April of 2008.
And what was the startup? What was the startup?
Yeah, a company called Boom Dash, right? And so, great name. And it was a really good idea in concept. In practice, we just it was very difficult, right? So here's what it was. Picture, got to take yourself way back to 2007, 2008. Okay, at that time, Google AdWords, search engine marketing, was somewhat established, but not well understood at all, and not well known. You know it very well, obviously, but people didn't really understand how to work with it. And so what we said is like, hey, we're going to build a kind of digital platform that integrates with AdWords, builds landing pages for your kind of mom and pop small business. And then, and this was the kicker, we were going to sell that through Yellow Page directories. So at the time, there were lots of these regional Yellow Page directories that had, at that point, still reasonable revenue base. People were still advertising.
And great margins.
These directories and fantastic margins, right? And so we said, my God, these guys have no digital offering. We can be their digital offering. Great idea, right? And isn't it great that this very technical heavy company can rely on somebody else, as a sales engine? Mm-hmm. And so boom, 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 checked all the boxes. Great founders there. One of them still a very close friend of mine now. And like, I'm in, let's do it, right?
Yep. So 80% pay cut. You're ready to not just work 80 hours a week, but to work all hours of the week, and get paid a whole lot less with this dream in front of you of this fantastic Yellow Pages partnership.
Yeah. And go all in. And what we found is that we experimented all over the place, and we could not, at the highest level, we could not get the Yellow Page directories at the time to recognize their industry was dying, right? Because they'd say, oh yeah, we totally want to sell this offering. We totally want to sell it, right? Yeah, we want to get some footprint there. And then you offer it to them, and they're like, their customers, their clients are saying, well, I only have so much budget. Well, which one are they going to pick? They continue to pick the higher margin one, right? Ours is obviously by default, ours is going to be lower margin. And so we tried all these experiments and kind of offerings and different yellow-based directories, and in the end, could not figure out the right way. And my big lesson here is like, hey, don't hitch your ride in the dying industry, right?
Yeah.
If that's the core lesson, that's what it is. And so, we tried for a year, and then the CEO and I had to just shut it down. Just the two of us shut it down in March of 2009.
Well, I think that's a really interesting period of time. I want to pause and say it's an interesting lesson, not just from a founder perspective, but from a business perspective, which is if you as an organization have the opportunity to cannibalize your own business, by all means, cannibalize your own business, because if you don't, someone else will. So from my perspective, I mean, that's the big miss of Kodak. That seems like the big miss with the Yellow Pages organization is an unwillingness to change and to be the disruptors yourself, because ultimately, their demise is largely well documented. And of course, this ultimately led to you forcing yourself to make this really hard decision to shut down the company. I want to know kind of what that moment was like, because this seems like a really big low in your career, because to date you've been working in largely a corporate position. You've been doing really well. You've been getting the feedback that you're doing really well. You give all that up. You give the comfortable salary up. You go and you launch something with some fantastic mentors, some people who are really experienced in this. And you have, in theory, every advantage known to man.
Yeah.
And you make this decision to call it.
Doesn't work, right? And I mean, it was, and I want to make sure it's clear. Like, I was the first employee in the company, and so not a founder, not the CEO, and it was just the CEO and I left, and he said, look, I can't continue to fund this company, and we just gotta, just can't continue, and of course I didn't have any money to help fund it, and I could see the writing on the wall anyway. And so, it was very much, I would say his decision with maybe some consultation with me and others, but it was a right decision, no question about it. It wasn't working. And so to the question of what do you do with that? What do I take from that? Here's the thing, because of exactly what you said, Brad, I came out of that experience with the most huge confidence, right? I was so excited about what was in front of me after that. And here's why. Everything you just said, fantastic founders, really, really solid opportunity, problem, and it didn't work out. And so what I took from that was like, well, man, if this thing can fail like that, with all of that there, what am I worried about? I got to go out and just try it myself. Mm-hmm. I got to drive something. I got to start something, right? Because of course, the reason I went in as a first employee, even though I wanted to be a founder, I was like, well, I don't know what I'm doing, right? And so I was like, nobody knows what they're doing. so why not? And so, and by the way, I mean, the other thing, I mean, this story, but for the benefit of the podcast, the week that we shut down the company, my wife told me we were pregnant with our first son. Same week. No job, no outlook. And so I gave myself 9 months to figure something out. And I was able to very quickly find a couple partners in that were also had experience consulting. And we built this nice little boutique clean tech consulting company that kind of ramped us up to a very reasonable income base. And then all along, I'm looking and trying to find, okay, where is my opportunity to start a tech company as a founder? Because I knew that was my next step. Like, I didn't want to be a consultant forever. I'd already done that, right? What was the opportunity? And so I was just networking all over to try to find that next opportunity. And then, of course, that's when I kind of came across the opportunity to start Shepherd.
And so if you need to start a new business and you need income, consulting is a great way to go about that, because it actually can get income in the door right away. But that also is a huge slog. And you didn't stay doing the clean tech consulting for very long. So you found yourself quickly pursuing what ultimately became a main competitor in the ride sharing ecosystem, and a competitor to Lyft and to Uber. I'd love to hear about how you translated this clean tech consultancy into a ride sharing player.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's a big chunk in between there, right? And so, as I was doing that work around Ann Arbor, trying to find what my kind of opportunity might be on starting a software company, I met this master's student at U of M through my friends at RPM, and one of my friends that I worked with at Boom Dash. And they said, hey, this young guy is working on some kind of fleet management software. It's sort of kind of a code base that's been built out from student projects, but there's an opportunity to maybe clean it up, and maybe there's something there. Adrian, you have some transportation experience. Maybe you want to go and have a chat. Had the chat, began to do some homework, and figured out that there is an opportunity. But of course, at that point, it was fleet management, right? So the management of fleets, like bus fleets, shuttles, limos, taxis, things like that, right? And this, we decided to partner up, and he and I founded this company called Shepherd IS. And this Shepherd IS was the first cloud-based fleet management solution. It started in 2009, and great opportunity. Rebuilt the code base, built a nice UI UX to offer to these university fleets and then small private fleets.
And it was started buying too, right? I mean,
absolutely.
You got customers. You're growing. You've got momentum at this point in time. Yep. You've got an emerging industry. You're an early mover. And things are happening. You guys have to be feeling pretty good about yourselves.
We were, but what we did find out after, you're right, we got business in Indiana, in Boston, in Michigan. What we found is that the market opportunity for that company was going to be relatively small, because it was just university fleets that really wanted it. It was too risky for municipal fleets. And then the taxi limos were just a little still tight, understandably, with what they could afford.
So you created $1 million business, and you said, what would be cool? $1 billion business.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Exactly right. So we started to brainstorm and about what else it could be. And we noticed how much, we had in consumer engagement, and sort of think, okay, what can we do? Because we were offering these estimated time of arrivals for these bus riders. And we put some investment materials out there. I ended up finding an interested investor and then subsequently partner in the Bay Area who was also thinking about next generation transportation. And we started to brainstorm, right? And we did for months on end about what it could be. He'd bring ideas, we'd bring ideas. And then in time, we came together to start, this new company effectively, right? They put some money in, some other folks put some money in, and initially kind of, built, the first, what turned into Sidecar, right? Didn't call it Sidecar at first because we were still kind of working through some things. And Sidecar was before Lyft. It was before most of these guys had really understood. I mean, we were trailblazers as it relates to rideshare, like true instant rideshare of what you see in UberX, what you see in Lyft. We were there at the forefront, and it was just an amazing experience, to do that. So we raised some money, my team here in Ann Arbor moved out to San Francisco. I then started going out there all the time. Was out there almost every week, kind of building that first community for Sidecar, and it was just a magical experience being able to build that, and also to be able to see San Francisco Bay Area is thought of as like the kind of the apex of startup ecosystem, right? And it was really interesting to be able to experience that too, especially now that I'm, based in the middle of the country.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I'm thinking back. So, for those who aren't familiar with Sidecar, Sidecar had an original business model that was different than Uber Black. It became similar to Uber X today, but it was basically a model where, hey, I'm going from point A to point B. If a rider was somewhere between point A and B, instead of having a ride board at a university or something, you could do it, through the app. You could do it online. I don't know what it was originally, and now you have a digital way of saying, hey, let me pick someone up. Like, that's kind of the Sidecar mentality. Is me as a driver, I'm going to work every day anyway, so I can pick someone else up. And Sidecar was really successful. Ultimately wound up being acquired by General Motors and GM. But of course it's not as well known as Uber and Lyft today. So I'm curious to hear, your personal experience as you evolved out of the business. How did that come to be? Because obviously you've since transitioned by way of FlockTag, another startup, but you're now, as we've mentioned a couple of times, you're a venture capitalist. But what was that exit like for you personally out of Sidecar?
Yeah. And I mean, and to be clear, like we preceded UberX, we preceded Lyft. We definitely were there at the forefront, kind of blazing new trails, and it was just a wonderful experience. To the question of kind of my kind of leaving operationally. So I mentioned I was going out there all the time, almost every week, sometimes 2 weeks on end, and yet. When that started, my second son had been born before I started that. And so we had a house in Michigan. I had 2 kids under 2, and I had my wife was still working as a teacher, right? And
That's a lot.
That's a lot. And so I did it, I did it for over a year. And, it got to a point where it just was too hard to do that, to be, head of operations and do all the work and have the family back here. And so, look, at some point I just said, to my partners there, like, hey, look, we can't make the move. It was still too early in from a company maturity perspective to justify that risk. And remember, I'm an engineer at heart, so there's still kind of a certain risk profile. I know I'm an early stage investor, but there's still something there, right? And so I didn't see that, and so it just sort of felt like, it was the right time to make the transition, and said, guys, I want to transition out operationally. I'll continue to be an advisor. I'll continue to be, help out, which I did, but I think that it's time for me to kind of come back home effectively, right? And then continue the journey, and building something new. And I had an opportunity then to focus a lot of my energy on FlockTag, which was kind of getting off the ground, at that point, and had a great opportunity to help build that out too with my partner there. And and then, as you said, kind of in time, transitioned to the investment side, initially at Invest Detroit, and then later on at Mercury.
I love this story because I feel like to be really successful in life, you need to get punched in the face a little bit. You need to experience some setbacks. And I remember an employee of mine previously who was just a rock star, had crushed everything to date, and he was applying to business schools. And I never shared this to him publicly because I didn't want it to be taken the wrong way. but I was secretly rooting for him to not get into his number one choice, not because I didn't want the best for him, but because I
Yeah.
did want the best for him,
Yeah.
because I wanted him to experience some of that adversity and
Yeah.
you know, it was some of that like drive to succeed and the need to prove themselves. But
Yeah.
I just couldn't imagine a better setup. So here you are, Adrian Fortino from middle of nowhere, Michigan, Alma, Michigan, and you
Somewhere.
go to the state school, and you find yourself out here in the Bay Area competing with the absolute best and brightest, and in a lot of cases winning.
Hmm.
And this is all happening after you've already had one failed startup under your
Yep.
belt.
Yep.
And this kind of feels like the dream scenario here, especially as a community builder, someone who's got a great network. And yet I know you went into flock tag, right? And so in the interest of time, maybe we'll fast forward because you had this really interesting rewards program
Yep.
that was growing in the Midwest and getting traction. But ultimately, you make a move that I think, as someone who considers themselves an operator themselves, is really hard to do, and I think
Hmm.
requires a huge mental shift where you move from being the hands-on operator to being the investor. So
Yep.
when you were going through that decision making,
Yep.
what was the driver for those decisions, and was there any part of you that felt unsatisfied in terms of what you had done to date as an operator?
Hmm. I don't think that there's anything that I felt unsatisfied in that. Every company that I had founded was certainly at a very strong position when I made the sort of transition. And so I think what I felt like is like I really like that first kind of founding level, grow, build out, right? And then, once there's a team there growing, building, I felt like I was a good point where I could kind of hand off the reins, to someone else, right? Um, and so I don't think there's anything that I would take from that. I do think though, as I go back and think about that, the way that was going through my head, look, I even from business school, I had an interest in venture capital, right? When I was talking to Tom and Tony, those mentors, I always had that interest. And so that was always in my head. I did an internship at the Michigan Venture Capital Association while I was in school there. And I always had that there. And so, in time, I felt like, again, FlockTag was in a good position. We had raised, some money, and we had built out a really, really strong team, pulled out the technology in house. And my partner Dave, who was always the CEO of the company, from the beginning, was like he was doing a great job. And I was like, okay, well, maybe there's an opportunity here for me to, stay on the board, and which I did, and maybe just take a little bit of a step back, but then have the opportunity to do something, basically scratch an itch that I hadn't had the chance to do yet. And so, I was interested in scratching that itch on the investment side, and
What do you
specifically because, Mhm. Yeah, go ahead.
what is it that you think allowed you to be successful as an entrepreneur, and then also allowed you to believe that you would be successful as an investor? And of course, now we have the benefit of hindsight. I know you're a humble guy. You'll still say it's still to be determined, but clearly you're an successful entrepreneur and investor. And so what are the characteristics that you look back in at yourself and in your career that you think has allowed you to be successful in these two certainly linked but distinct worlds?
So I firmly believe that operationally heavy early stage investors, me, look a lot like founders, like really look a lot like them, right? We all have to be able to see things that aren't there and aren't obvious to others. We need to see around the corner competitively, in certain industries,
Mm-hmm.
and we need to build incredible teams. And I think that there is way more commonality. Like that Venn diagram, there's so much overlap, in my opinion, in that Venn diagram between the early stage, the kind of seed level investor and founder, that I felt confident that I would go in and be able to create some value and be helpful and supportive. Here's the other thing, like, because of my journey, I have incredible empathy for how hard it is to build a company. And I try to, do my best to walk that every day as I'm working with companies and meeting new companies, working with CEOs that I sit on the boards of, or companies that sit on the boards of. But like, that's incredibly important to me, to continue to be that empathetic investor, because it is really lonely and it's really hard to be that CEO founder, right? And so I guess I just felt like there was a good opportunity for me, and I felt like Invest Detroit, because we were just doing pre-seed and seed investments, and we were doing it in a lot of different kinds of investments, different kinds of companies.
Right.
It's a great way for me to kind of cut my teeth a bit and learn a bit on the job, which I very much did.
So, Adrian, it's interesting because as a society, we're trained to think of startups as sexy. And we think of Mark Zuckerberg and Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos and people who are building these huge empires, and it's cool. But I'm starting to think from your perspective, it's a little bit different, right? I mean, even the entrepreneurship network that you created, it was called Beers and Tears. And one of the things you're talking about is, as an investor, empathy and understanding how damn hard it is a huge asset that you bring to Mercury Fund. Why is it that starting companies is so hard?
Man, that's a great question. So I think that it's so incredibly hard because there is no set recipe. There is no sort of, you do 1, 2, 3, and you're there. It just doesn't work like that. There are too many variables. The world is too dynamic. People are too dynamic. And so that's why it's incredibly important for, in my view, for founders to surround themselves with the most valuable, objective advisors they can have, right? And to be able to, for people to be able to call bullshit on them when they're going down the wrong path. And I think that lots of people can operate that way. I think that mentors can. I think co-founders can. I think investors can. But you got to build that early on, because it's incredibly hard. There's so many companies and so many people trying to compete in various sectors that, to think that, if I took this approach this time before and I take the exact same approach, it might not work. It might work, but the success rate of startups is pretty low.
Very low, very low. And what's interesting is the best success rate, the best success rate for founders is those in their 40s and 50s. And the best success rate also comes from people who've been working in the industry for so long, because there is a lot of nuance to any business or any industry. And having the advantage of living in that for so long is extremely helpful. And I love what you said about the importance of having honest and forthright advisors around you. And one of the sayings that I live by, and those who have been on any of my teams know as well, is a true friend is someone who will tell you when you have spinach in your teeth. Because it's hard, right? Because you don't want to be like, yeah, hey, Adrian, right there between your left big front tooth, because it's kind of like it's a little awkward, but my goodness,
Yeah,
it's so much better to have one
it is.
awkward conversation than to look like an ass in front of tens or maybe even hundreds or thousands of people if you're on stage, right?
On a podcast.
Your teeth look great for the record, but I think that's something that is really important. And I think some of my friends, I can be a bit of a pain in the ass because I am going to shoot people straight, but at the same time, when I'm telling you like, oh, I really like this, or this is great, there's nothing in the back of your mind that is like, is Brad really like this? Because it's like, no, I'm going to let you know if I'm not a fan of it.
I do. And that's why I love working with you so much at Catapult, right? You were unvarnished in your feedback to everybody in the room. And it's it's really rare too, and I just don't, I think it's an unappreciated characteristic for people to be direct, I mean, it's almost like kind of being empathetically direct, like, hey, kind of sucks, but we got to handle this. Like, we can talk through this. Right?
Absolutely. Well, one of the, I'd love to hear your take, right? So you've been through the wars as an entrepreneur. You're now an investor. When you're looking at entrepreneurs, so this is less a question about the business and more about the person.
Yeah.
What are the characteristics that you're looking for in great leaders and great entrepreneurs?
Yeah. So you covered one of them already. I firmly believe in subject matter expertise, SME, right? If a founder, and keep it like, I primarily invest in B2B companies, right? Sometimes it's B2B to C and B2B to C2B, but still, generally speaking, most of the times that I'm going to be kind of get interested, there's going to be some business component usually. And when you have that SME, that subject matter expertise, I believe incredibly important, right? So that's sort of a, you kind of have that's like a thing, right?
Love it. Yep.
And then the kind of the who, or the, I, as a founder, as an operator, like, I'm not going to get into weeds of like trying to direct or prescribe any kind of tactical actions with the company, but I do really thrive in a dynamic where I am like on the phone talking through various decisions, with the company. And again, this is them calling me. This is them saying, hey, I need your input here. Hey, can I get a little feedback here?
Yeah,
right?
proactively
That's
looking for support.
Proactively. And you can actually figure that out in the first couple conversations with someone. And sometimes, they've got enough experience that they feel like I'm good, like I just really need the money and maybe a little bit of outside, views on a board level basis or a frequency. And that's great, right? That's not a great fit for me and for us as a fund, but there's nothing wrong with that. And so, I definitely kind of hedge toward, okay, hey, who are some very capable people, but maybe don't think that they have all the answers or don't have the experience to lead them to have all the answers, such that, hey, we can be helpful, right? And I think you kind of marry that up, like my experience, whether on the industrial side or the kind of enterprise build out side, I can help that CEO or that team really kind of scale up the company. And that kind of marriage is what I probably look for most.
Love it. Yeah, I think it is a relationship. Maybe it's not quite as tight as a marriage, but it's not that far away when you talk
Not
about a lead investor and an early
Yep.
stage, startup that's partnering with a venture capital. So that fit and having your styles work together is really important. And so, I mean, I think that's true for anyone out there that's looking to start a business, whether it's a hair salon or a big tech startup. If you're going to engage with a partner, which is really smart to do, make sure that there is incredible amount of trust, that your styles jive. That doesn't mean that your styles are the same, but they have to be able to jive and be able to work together. And clearly that's something that you have an eye for. You've got a fantastic bullshit meter. I think you call it a spidey sense, a little bit more sophisticated and refined way of saying it, but I think that's, such an important skill, as an investor. And in the interest of time, we'll kind of move on, because I'd love to, pick your brains, and maybe we can have you back on the podcast at a future date. But a few questions here before I let you go. So as a big time investor, my words, not yours. I mean, your organization does have over $300 million in investment, which is not a trivial dollar amount to anyone. But I got to ask you, on a personal level, do you have a Robinhood account?
No.
Oh, I thought I thought I might be able to
I'm
catch you
not much
there.
of a retail investor.
Now that tells me you're one of the real guys. I have a Robinhood account. I am not one of the real investors, but I appreciate that. Okay. What is the best piece of advice that you've ever received?
As I was graduating from college, undergrad, my dad said to me, look, you're going into the workforce. Now you're going to be kind of around lots of different people, right? And you'll get along, easy for you to get along with people. But look, if there's one thing I'd say, is like, do everything possible to learn from other people's mistakes, not just your own. And now you and I think about that, which is obvious. Like you and I do that naturally right now, Brad. But if you take yourself back to the young, kid coming out of undergrad, getting their first job, that was like this, like, boom, like, oh my God, I'd never even thought about that before. That never occurred to me, because it's always been, hey, learn from your mistakes. Learn from your mistakes. Well, of course you do that. Try to. But if you can have your head up and like seeing what else is out there, right? Because that takes you, that you see that in startups, you see that in venture capital, you see that everywhere, right? And so that was a big sort of like, oh my, okay, yeah, I need to be thinking about, like, not so internally focused, but like externally too.
Yeah. If that's something that you can truly internalize, you're going to be a step ahead of 99% of the people, because it's not easy to do, learning from other people's mistakes. Adrian, what's your biggest pet peeve?
So I'd circle back to one of the things that we talked about briefly. We are kind of capital partners, right? I mean, it's really important to us and to me personally that we are a partner with the founders of companies. And so one of the things that maybe it's a less of a pet peeve, I guess it probably could be considered that, is, when I perceive that companies are really just looking for capital, but they're saying they want the help. Like, I don't think you really want the kind of help that that maybe I think that you need or you want. But look, everybody's entitled, their companies do whatever they want. But I think it's when a situation that you see a lot, just like, hey, I definitely want, I want a partner, I want that. But then, you kind of see like, no, I think you just want the money, right?
Mm-hmm.
And for some investors, that's a great fit, right? Have at it. Man, it's not a good fit for us, know? And we've had that happen. I mean, it's hard not to here and there, but I really try to kind of, index on the people that really are really truly interested in getting, a real thought partner in the engagement.
Yeah, I mean, two great pieces for us to leave on. Number one, make sure you keep your eyes and ears open, learning from other people's mistakes, and number two, when you're talking about the importance of really being surrounded by people who are open to feedback and open to partnerships, because we don't have all the answers at ourselves. I mean, at Muskox, we like say we're strong on our own, but we're much better as part of a herd. And I think people who get that mindset are so much better off, and it's gonna ultimately turn out to better investments for a venture capitalist and better relationships for all of us, I think.
Yeah, totally. It's the relationships that matter the most.
It is. It is. And Adrian, speaking of relationships, it's an honor to call you a friend, and definitely appreciate you being part of the Muskox herd and join us here on the Herd Has Spoken. Well, thank you, Adrian, again for joining us here on episode 15 of The Herd Has Spoken. I hope you guys took away a few good nuggets from today's conversation with Adrian. I know I really appreciated him talking about just his commitment to work and refining his craft, particularly early on in his career. I think that just begets so much opportunity that's really tough to put a finger on. I love the nonlinear path of his career. I think that's something that a lot of our guests here on The Herd Has Spoken can relate to. So putting in that extra effort, really working hard to try to find ways to add value. And it's amazing how often people point back to those challenging times and those hours and hours and hours spent working as really defining moments in their career. So kudos to Adrian. We appreciate him joining us here on Muskox, The Herd Has Spoken. If you're not familiar with Muskox, please check out our website, gomuskox.com. Men's apparel that are suited for your everyday adventures. If you've got a big trip coming up, or you're just settling in and you want something where you're going to look fantastic at the office and out for a hike locally, Muskox has got you covered. So please go ahead and check out Muskox if that's something that's of interest to you. Either way, we appreciate you tuning into the Herd Has Spoken. I am your host, Brad Hoos, and until next time, roam freely.